Hi. So I'm the head of mobile at Nomensa. I work in UX design technology. And one of the things I do a lot is test with members of the public and with clients on mobile devices. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is how unique the environment of every single individual's phone is to them. The phone is a complex ecosystem that can support a host of what I would call tiny specialist applications, and each one's competing for the resources of our attention and our data. And for each app, the struggle for existence is very real. It takes under a second to delete an app that's not performing, and mobile users are notoriously fickle for what they will put up with. The brutal nature of the deletion reflects also many of my clients' experiences of lovingly crafting an app, making a beautiful interface, having a big launch day, and then it being savagely rejected by those in the App Store. Each app is built to answer a very specific niche task, so getting a taxi, checking your data, making a payment. But looking at the home screen and this grid of tiny specialists, I was reminded of this famous illustration. These are Darwin's finches, a drawing by Darwin when he went to the Galapagos Islands. Darwin wondered how, in a closed ecosystem of this small island, several distinct species of finches all had such differently shaped beaks. And they all used them in completely different ways. From these observations, he went home, and 23 years later, he brought out his groundbreaking book on the origin of the species. And here he'd outlined the evidence for a system that he called natural selection. Some more birds. So let's have a little look at some of these guys in a bit more detail. So you've got your ground finch with a sturdy, blunt-ended beak. And then you've got your warbler finch, which is a slender, pointy beak and a delicate frame. What Darwin noticed was that these two different species, although they had a shared ancestor of the ground finch from the mainland, were eating completely different food sources. They'd found separate niches to occupy. So the ground finch was eating hard, crunchy nuts and equally crunchy insects, while the warbler finch was picking off tiny insects from the foliage. What he noted was that their bodies and their behavior seemed perfectly suited to a very specific niche of their food source. What Darwin saw was that this wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't cosmic luck that had given the ground finch exactly the kind of beak it wanted for the kind of food it liked. The island had a limited number of food sources, and so each bird was a specialist in a certain niche of that food source. There were many competing theories coming out at the time, but what Darwin proposes is that rather than some top-down plan or strategy that hands out these roles to creatures, the birds had adapted in some way to exploit the resources of that very specific niche rather than compete with each other for a shared food source. The birds were finding a niche without competitors rather than competing for the same food source. In digital, this is in many ways what the big disruptors do. They're finding a new space without niche and without competition. Being a specialist adapted to consume a particular non-competed resource makes a lot of sense, and in the app world, the idea is prevalent. So Uber, for example, set up a new service, and for some time they're a sole operator in a completely niche of their own. Natural selection and evolution has a set of rules, complex mechanisms, but they are ones which we can recognize and that we can harness. And actually, I think as designers, we're often using a lot of these mechanisms daily, maybe without realizing it. One of the analogies that Darwin used, I think is quite useful, is the tree of life. Each visible branch is built on the remains of numerous shoots that once grew, but via competition for resource, so light and nutrients, one twig will position itself to be the most successful, and in doing so, it will starve the neighboring shoots of resources. So it is in the digital world. In apps, for example, thousands have been created, and each branch in a digital tree is a strong, well-built app that's maintained by a team with many updates and access to the resources it needs to thrive. The resources a digital branch might need are things like users, attention, data, marketing, and of course investment as a nutrient that feeds it. But there are only so many humans with smartphones in the world, and so the struggle to access them becomes the app's struggle for existence. So this diagram here tries to describe all the species that have ever existed on Earth, so all life ever. Of all life on Earth, only 1% still exists. The rest is extinct. Extinction then is the rule, not the exception. One of the reasons I chose apps, other than being head of mobile, and it'd be weird if I talked about something else, is that it's 10 years this summer since the launch of the App Store, so a brand new ecosystem that didn't exist before. And in those 10 years, we've seen millions of developers make billions of pounds, and apps go out onto billions of smartphones. And in that 10 years of app history, it's very much like 6 billion years in the natural world in terms of the rate of evolution. Within this closed system, we can also get some good statistical information on the apps and what their lifespan looked like. Here's a representation of all the apps that have ever existed in the 10 years of the App Store. The apps alive today is quite a similar percentage. And what's interesting is that of all the apps that have ever existed, 50% were deleted by Apple. So 50% were pruned for not updating operating system, not maintaining multiple screen sizes, having problematic content like pirate music or cloned games. Apple's aim, and nature's aim, is to prune so as to increase the overall health of the ecosystem. Most of those apps are not extinct because of that. The kind of purge of apps by Apple is sort of like the asteroid that took out the dinosaurs. It's an extreme event, and it doesn't happen every day. Generally, mass extinction is an exceptional cause, and most species and apps alike are extinct because another has taken its place. Another is consuming its resources, occupying its niche, and maybe is a new, improved version or an outsider that's found a better way to exploit those resources. The constant flux of species then into new spaces and the replacement of the animals in those spaces with improved variation is kind of what I want to look at a bit more deeply today and see if this analogy can help us to understand the digital landscape better and so improve our odds of success in an app ecosystem. So a bit then on the mechanics of evolution. So the engine of change is a process of creating these offshoots, these variations, and then allowing the pressures of the environment to destroy a fairly high number of them. Darwin noted that the geometrical ratio of increase would mean that a species without a struggle for existence, left unchecked, would increase in its numbers so much that a country could not support it. In the app world, we're still discovering what the ceiling is on how many apps can be sustained. If trends continue, we expect to see 5 million apps in the App Store by 2020. There's 2.2 million currently. With Apple's culling and with most successful apps out there being updated on average every 10 days, what's clear is that successful apps tend to go for constant maintenance and constant improvement. As Darwin said when considering this, if some of these many species become modified and improved, others will have to be improved in a corresponding degree, or they will be exterminated. So it is with apps. We must look at the legacy that's being created, the whole strong branch and not the individual shoots that may be pruned to increase the overall health of the organism. In nature, when an animal procreates, the next generation combines the parent's genetic material and produces a number of variations. So within a litter of animals, cute little foxes here, you might have one with a different coloured coat, maybe another has a longer tail, another has lower cognitive function. A species will not maintain an infinite number of variations. Only variation that offers some kind of advantage to the animal or gives better odds of surviving will be passed on. Darwin described it like this: the struggle for existence leads to the preservation of profitable deviations of structure or instinct. If a slightly different colouring means that that animal blends into the forest floor better and escapes predators, then it's going to be more successful. It's got more likelihood of surviving to adulthood and having its own offspring, and they will inherit that colouring also. So rinse and repeat this over millennia, and what you get is an apparent mechanic. Within digital, a strong app will release many variations, such as a slightly different UI style, a new navigation pattern, a different algorithm. Only those that benefit the overall fitness of the app will be preserved. So, for example, when Facebook created a variation without the hamburger menu and a tab bar instead, what they saw were increases across the board on engagement, satisfaction, revenue, speed, and perception of speed. Less thumb strain on the iPhone 7 Plus as well, I would imagine. If a feature has a negative effect on this fitness, such as decreasing downloads or lowering revenue, then it also should be pruned. We pass on a code base, and each iteration we can choose what variation is taken forward. What's clear in nature and is reflected in the digital world is that without a mechanic or an engine for variation and experimentation, when creating a new generation of products, there's no chance of creating profitable change. As another of my heroes put it, without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. Look up Frank Zappa afterwards if you want. I recommend Weasels Rip My Flesh, but variation and deviation from the norm then need to be embraced by business at every level. But we know that there are often barriers to creating this engine of evolution at the heart of what we're doing. I'm going to talk a bit about these barriers and how we overcome them with this engine of evolution, UX, and design thinking. So here are some of them that I've observed, clients' products, my own products, across the board. 1, variation and deviation is minimized to avoid risk. 2, holding on to non-profitable deviations for too long. And 3, random variation without direction and without structure. Go through them, shall we? So 1, variation and deviation minimized to avoid risk. To create deviations and variations that might move you closer to the next phase, the teams must be allowed to push the edges of what's possible. We've seen that with the NHS project. I think it's a really, really good example of how big teams can find the edges and really map what's possible. The best results come from diversely skilled teams with a range of creative styles. So they're focusing on being generative, being positive, and allowing these embryonic ideas to be formed. I've always said it's easier to carve up a big, exciting idea into modest iterations than it is to make a very boring idea interesting. Openness, curiosity, optimism are at the core of what design thinking is, and that has to be what the team works through. I would add also that a healthy dose of amnesia is useful at some times, so as not to discount ideas that have been rejected in previous contexts. Pterodactyls, bats, flying squirrels, they all teach us that an idea can be realized in a multitude of ways and be equally successful. As Darwin said, if some of these many species become modified and improved, others will have to be improved in a corresponding degree or they will be exterminated. Stagnation is just not an option in the natural world, and the same is true in digital. The riskiest strategy is to stay the same. So we've all heard the old adage, don't cling to a mistake just because you spent a long time making it. Letting go of non-profitable features is hard to do, and maybe it's because we're in a creative industry that destruction seems like the opposite of progress, but I believe that through the insights gained by making mistakes, they're as valuable to us as the code base of the project, and they're something we should take through each stage. We just need to reframe it. UX and during testing with our users, every failure you pick up in the lab is a problem your customers now don't have. Exactly as Matt said, your product is going to be tested. Are you going to test it, or are you going to let it go out in the wild? And it's worth thinking of these non-profitable features in terms of total cost of ownership. Sure, you've got a feature. It's not really giving you any value, but it's not causing you any harm either. And you can be thinking, let's have a quiet life and leave it there. But an operating system update comes out. Suddenly you've got regression testing issues. Suddenly you've got a back-end fix. The total cost of this benevolently useless feature now starts skyrocketing. And you're in a position where it's bringing no benefit and it's damaging the rest of your project. So be kind. And snip that shoot for the overall health of an organism. So some of this might start feeling familiar, and I didn't check with Matt, but I'm going to put the double diamond up as well. But we're talking here, aren't we, about creating variations and then trimming variations down, right, to make a series of choices and a series of definitions. But what we're doing, and what fixes my third point, is that we're adding a third diamond in. Don't at me about the 3-diamond thing, but we're putting another one in. And we're doing this to allow for what I'm terming structured deviation. So in nature, variations are produced in each generation seemingly at random, and the advantage we have over our animal friends is that we can take a conscious decision to shape the direction of our product's evolution. We can be the gardener or the tree surgeon who guides growth towards the resources and provides additional nutrients, and we do this through UX strategy. Unstructured deviation is maybe the fail fast and break things approach, which what you risk is building without a strong direction and make an efficiently produced monstrosity. What I'm advocating for is fail briskly and in the right direction. UX has a wide range of tools to inform the evolution of a product. Through research, we can discover new continents without predators, or technology to minimize the cost of deviation. And any mature product team, UX will be generating insights. And insight as an asset is the most valuable resource we have for the health of our organism. Without structure, a fail-fast approach may lead us to an evolutionary cul-de-sac with a very efficiently constructed dodo. So the triple diamond gives us constant feedback, and through testing, through analytics, through talking to users, we're going to best represent our customers in our products and provide the many channels we need to get insight. This engine of evolution will move our species along our strong branch, guiding the direction of evolution so that we can take control of our environment, allow a safe space for deviation and experimentation, and pruning the shoots to provide a strong, well-maintained branch for our customers to use. On to cars. No, not cars. Darwin was often in a position of having to prove his ideas to a hostile audience, and one of the criticisms that was often thrown at him, and which is still thrown around in certain circles, is that this engine of slight variation and preservation of profitable features can't explain the complexity and the specialization of some organic features. The human eye is still sometimes talked about as this evolutionary impossibility because it's a complex machine in a perfect state. In a digital world, often the project's aspirations are to produce something with the complexity and the value of the human eye, and teams can become disheartened when there's only resource or capability to produce what can be described as an imperfect solution. Nature knows that there's no such thing as an imperfect solution, and it has a valuable lesson to teach us. Starfish has a fairly sedate life. It moves slowly across the seabed and feeds on the odd mollusk it comes across. A starfish also has 5 eyes, one on each leg. It doesn't have complex eyeballs like us. It has 5 fairly simple eye spots, which are a few light-sensing cells that form an optic cushion and a fluid-filled dome over the top that protects it and focuses a certain amount of light. It can sense which of its limbs are in darkness and adjust its direction accordingly, but that's about it. Given that a starfish spends the majority of its life looking directly up at the sea, anything else would probably be quite unnecessary, and that's really what the starfish teaches us. The starfish is the original MVP solution. A minimum viable product, and it's probably a term you hear a lot, and sometimes I think we hear it so often the meaning gets lost. You also may hear minimum lovable, minimum marketable, minimum profitable products, but understand that's just what makes it viable to you. The starfish then has an MVPI. Minimum in that it uses the least resources possible and it has the simplest components it can. Viable, it has enough features to consume mollusks and position its limbs. And product, it has a defined set of components that could be improved individually in future iterations, although the starfish is, as far as we know, unaware of this. On closer inspection of a starfish's eye spot, something else important becomes apparent. The constituent components of the eye spot are not dissimilar to our Ferrari-level eyes. The optic nerve has been enhanced, the light-sensing cells have become the millions of rod and cone cells on our retina that sense colour, depth, and the dome has been repurposed into this fluid-filled lens that allows perfect focus. A digital MVP should be the same, the least resources possible, the simplest components possible, with a view as to how they can be enriched and evolved in the future to fulfill a more complex need or operate in a more challenging environment. What it does not mean is all we could afford or enough to look okay in the advert. That would be like throwing half a starfish in a pond and wondering why it floats to the surface. It needs to be a simple but independently thriving species with a basic framework that can be improved through our engine of constant variation and our preservation of profitable deviations. One might think then that post-MVP, the aim of our organisation is always going to be to add more and more complexity to each component until every single feature is the Ferrari of its class. That might make sense if you're Ferrari, for instance, but for most people, evolution does not look to preserve the most complex or the most unique solution. It preserves the most suitable for the environment with the available resources. Complexity for complexity's sake does not make a product more successful. Evolution has a lot of tools ready to go, and one method it uses is homologous solutions. In nature, you can see how over time a set of components, bones in this instance, are modified and re-articulated to serve a new purpose. So the same set of bones here form the structure of a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, a cat's paw, and a human's hand. Nature is not wasteful, and it will reuse components for a new purpose rather than create a new organ. A fish's swim bladder is modified to create the lungs of a land-dwelling animal. Our own pelvis shares the same structure as a cat and a snake. By varying the presentation of the same components, we can operate in a new environment. So let's have a look at a very specific example from the digital world. A homologous, then, digital example would be GPS, originally a US government project from the 70s to pinpoint the location of nuclear submarines. After investment and refinement, the SPS, or Standard Positioning Service, was made available in 1993 to anyone who would like to use it for free. And I think it's worth pausing in this time of net neutrality erosion and freemium services to think about how radical that seems today, that a technology of amazing possibility is released to the world for free in the hope of creating a collective good. A basic component then is released, a feature that might be used in different contexts. It's only going to be able to do one thing: use the position of known satellites to triangulate a position on Earth. Early use was mainly military, but after that, we got aircraft using it. I remember my dad got one for the boats, which he was very excited about. Soon, GPS was in your car. maps loaded onto a hard drive, which you could update every 2 or 3 years, new environments that GPS could be re-articulated for and in a new context. With the advent of mobile, and mobile data in particular, a multitude of new environments opened up for GPS. Google and Apple Maps revolutionized how people navigate around cities. Internet search was upgraded when location could be passed as a variable into search terms. Today, as you're catching Pokemon applied via augmented reality to your location, you might consider the scientists in the 70s who'd be quite surprised by how that tech has been reimagined today. And as with fish and land-dwelling mammals, where a swim bladder has been repurposed as lungs, so also apps have repurposed GPS to order a taxi to you, to meet a date in your area, to deliver a sandwich to you. Innovation through repurposing an existing technology and using the same constituent parts rather than creating new components is something we can experiment with in our engine of evolution. We would ask our team, what can we reuse to fit an entirely different context? As well as repurposing our components, nature has a quieter, less flashy way of using the least resources possible to thrive. The eyes of the star-nosed mole are very small, malformed, and often skin and fur grows over them. As its ancestors changed context from a small animal that hunted along the forest floor to one that lives and hunts underground, the eyes as a feature became less and less useful. Now, this doesn't mean that as you use something less, it just disappears. Again, it goes back to making use of limited resources and preserving what is profitable. As the eye becomes less important for the mole's survival in its new underground context, those variations born with smaller or closed eyes will be equally as successful as those with great eyes. What those with smaller eyes have that the perfect-eyed mole doesn't is the additional resource and energy that those features can be put against. So they used to be used for growing eyes and processing complex visual information. These resources can be invested into another more useful feature for its new context. This route through evolution is reinforced by the fact that moles with small eyes are less likely to scratch them or damage them when they're burrowing. We can see how this could apply to our digital products. If a feature is no longer of benefit or integral to the success of the overall product, we would be wise to downscale it and use those resources on something that would be a benefit to us, remove the liability of having an unused feature. Again, thinking about the total cost of ownership. In the case of the mole, the resources it saves by not growing complex eyes and processing visual information, it's used to power an incredibly sensitive nose that can better detect food underground. It also used the savings in processing power to interpret these really complex nose signals, the huge percentage of its overall cognitive energy being spent on nose stuff. iPlayer did something similar with the new context of modern video streaming services like Netflix or Amazon. Having a whole piece of real estate, developers, servers, APIs, all dedicated to radio programs didn't make a lot of sense. So once useful feature set that no longer benefited the overall fitness of the app, iPlayer removed most of those features and repurposed those resources into things to help it better compete. Innovation through saving resources to be more effective might not seem as good a press release, but it is a highly successful strategy for maintaining the overall health of your species. The engine of evolution could equally create variations on the themes of what could we live without. This kind of thinking allows us to keep our code bases lean and efficient. It gives us time and money to invest in other things that better suit our overall strategy. So, when considering successful species and also successful apps, we can often see characteristics that seem impractical or at least an unusual choice for investing significant amounts of resource in. When looking at animals here, I looked at the weird and wonderful species that have seemingly inexplicable features. So the complex bright feathers and dances of the birds of paradise, the huge inflatable noses of elephant seals, or the spiraling antlers of the kudu, all seem like odd choices given the struggle for existence we've talked about. When an animal like a mole descopes its own eyes, an important feature, phase 1, I would have put them in, to better distribute resources, it's hard to imagine what motivates a bird to grow a tail so long they have difficulty taking off and that makes them easy pickings for predators. I would say I felt equal levels of confusion when looking at some of the features an app chooses to invest its limited resources in. Some examples include, but are not limited to, interrupted loading screens to really showcase a brand, complex refresh animations that refresh nothing, custom leather-stitched effect tab bars, augmented reality business cards, and inconceivably mysterious gestural interfaces. To quote another great scientific mind, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. What can nature tell us about this? Let's look at one of our well-known show-offs, the peacock. The male of the species then has this amazing tail with these beautiful symmetrical patterns. And what evolutionary need is that fulfilling? It uses a lot of energy to build it. It's actually getting in the way of the peacock's everyday life. What Darwin and others have explained is it is secondary sexual selection. So that means the peacock has a big tail to attract lady peacocks and make baby peacocks. It also means that peahens have a preference for big tails and will choose to mate with the male with the most highly ornamented one. Some of Darwin's contemporaries talked about this mechanism as being nature's way of asserting an innate sense of beauty and wonder in the world. And it's a poetic idea that love makes the world aesthetically pleasing. Certainly in digital, we dally with the idea of delight. Delight is that moment in an experience where, through a complex combination of relevancy, aesthetics, haptics, usability, and many other tiny nudges in a design, someone just feels that they inexplicably like doing the task at hand. So is beauty and delight an inherent trait that we can pass on? It's complex, but our sense of beauty and delight are definitely important to what we create in the app ecosystem. On peacocks then, Ronald Fisher, an evolutionary mathematician, put forward the Fisherian runaway to explain the impractical features that peacocks invest their energy in. The model presumes that initially the ornament was a sign of fitness in an animal. So preference for the ornament in the female would also increase the amount of baby peacocks with the inherited fitness. Subsequently, females simply preferred the exaggerated tail, and the overall fitness was overridden. Over generations, this leads to a runaway selection by positive feedback. The trait becomes more and more exaggerated, but the fitness it used to signify is no longer there. Many an app creator has killed a budget chasing delight in their app. Delight is a wonderful thing to create in an experience, but you can easily find yourself trapped in this runaway feedback loop where the chase for delight has become maladaptive to the overall fitness of your product. An example from the digital world then of delight creating an escalating experience that eclipses the fitness of our product. At one point, the idea of curating and personalizing experiences was seen as a signal of fitness. It made sense. The types of feed we're consuming were much more complex than they used to be. There were 10 times more users generating more and more content. And so chronologically displaying our feeds was impractical, given the limited resource of users' attention. Users expected to be able to express a preference as to what they would see, and that be reflected in an algorithm that personalized their content feeds. Over the last few years, however, and exactly as Matt was talking about here, these algorithms for curating and personalizing data have become more and more complex. they've escalated. They're so clever and yet so opaque that users question what's happening under the hood. They've bred a lack of trust in content and polarized people into bubbles or tribes where they no longer interact with those who don't share their algorithm's viewpoint. We could say that our initial delight over a curated online experience has run away from us. Social media companies then are battling what they're calling contextual collapse, as people turn off in their thousands from content that's become curated to the point of irrelevance. What once was a signal of fitness and a source of delight has escalated and run away from us, becoming a huge liability to the overall fitness and success of these social media companies, and a huge drain on their resources. So what is it that we do in this situation? Well, we can be conscious of this phenomenon. Is delight still attached to an indication of fitness? Or are we just obsessed with a trendy feature that we could invest more and more in, but we should really ask ourselves if we should? If a bit of ornamentation is still giving your customers that moment of delight in your app, then absolutely great, keep it going. But we want beauty and wonder within UX. We don't want to operate in a vacuum where user needs are evidenced and documented and the room for creativity and nuance is gone. The problem only comes when, through striving for delight, we compromise our fitness and leave ourselves vulnerable to being left behind. Consider then the cheetah. Elegant, sleek, fast, powerful, and beautiful, but every adaptation is a practical feature for operating at the very peak of its environment. Delight and ornamentation are fun, but sometimes delight comes from being able to do my taxes on the bus so I can spend the evening with my family, or find the nearest tube station in the dark at night. The lean, practical beauty of a job well done and done efficiently is delight enough for me. So I'm going to leave you with Darwin's conclusion as from The Origin of the Species. It's interesting to contemplate a tangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. I hope you'll take some time to take a look at your apps through this lens and spend some time understanding the environment in which you're operating, to consider if there are other ways where you could find more space. Consider the predators that you need to be prepared for and what niche they're filling. Of your apps, consider the components that they're made of, the base elements, and how you might improve them, change them, simplify them to better use your precious resources in this environment. And finally, in this complex web where the room for beauty and fun and delight is everywhere, just check in and make sure everyone is still having a good time. Thank you very much.